Welcome back to the CEPA 2024 Tech Forum. My name is Joseph. I'm a national security reporter at Politico. I write the morning cybersecurity newsletter. Here to my left, I want to introduce you to our esteemed panelists. First, we have Andrew Thompson. She's the CEO of Dakota State Applied Research Company and the former Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at State. Okay. To her left, we have former Congressman Will Hurd, former member of Congress from Texas 23, and a former CIA officer focused on counterterrorism. All the way on the left, Dr. Lorenz Meyer. He's the founder and CEO of Oterion, a Western drone tech company, and the world's most used autopilot for drones. So thank you everyone for joining us. To get started, obviously there's not a lot of news going on these days, right? I want to reach out to I want to talk to everyone on the panel, and I want to get everyone's opinion here and just start, so we get an idea of your opinions. What tech areas will best define the US and Western future global relevance the most?
Great question. First, yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks to CEPA and for inviting us, important discussions. Thanks to those attending, looking to some familiar faces, and for our international partners, greatly appreciate you making the time, because this is a global challenge. This isn't US only, so really appreciate it. When you talk about which tech will define the future, we talked a little bit beforehand in the green room. Whatever we're thinking about the future, we're probably going to get it wrong. We've learned that time and time again, but we get close. And so before I was in state, before I was a CEO of a startup, I did 28 years in the US Army as an intel officer, where your role is to give predictive analysis to the commander so he or she can make decisions on the battlefield. Most of the times we got close, so this is similar for technology. We talked about, is it cyber? Then it involves, is it AI and cyber? Is it quantum? It's going to be post-quantum. And as we're working, so I'm affiliated with the university. Dakota State University is a small startup, the not-for-profit small business. As we train, educate our students, we recognize that many of the things we're training today may not even be relevant by the time they're leading companies in the tech space. So to me, it's not a technology challenge that's going to define the future. It's going to be people in our processes. So if we have that workforce development and the people that have the flexibility and the skills to adapt to those changing environments, I think that's what's going to define the future for us, workforce development. And I hope we talk more about that. Thanks, Joe.
Definitely. Congressman?
If I were to say what's going to drive or screw up the relationship between US and Europe, I'd actually say it's interoperability. It's not any one of these particular tech. All of those things matter, right? Most people probably think, I was going to say AI. Quantum, I think, is the one thing that we're way behind. We thought, I think there's enough people in here old enough to remember Y2K. But the government spent $4 billion preparing for Y2K to have the year go from 2-digit to 4-digit, 4B, right? Like, quantum's gonna be even harder, but it's the interoperability issue, and it's interoperability on our systems, our devices, it's interoperability on how we understand privacy, right? The fact that Europe and the US from a regulatory and legislative perspective still don't recognize we agree on way more than we don't is problematic. And I think until our allies as a group realize that this isn't actually exponential change that we're seeing, it's hyperbolic change. So you get to infinity over a finite period of time. The amount of change that we're gonna see in this next 43 years, I always use 43 because I start with the personal computer, like the amount of change we've seen since the IBM personal computer came out in 1981 to now is significant. And we're gonna see 200,000 years of progress. Not what we saw over the last 100 years. So if we don't get that right and move faster, fast beats slow, obviously. Big doesn't necessarily beat small, and it's a mindset that's going to get in our way.
Got it. Dr. Meyer?
So I think that interoperability is a great segue. So we built a common operating system for drones, and it's the common language for NATO, for US forces. We've been working with the DoD for the past 6 years. And now we're starting to work with European countries, Dutch, UK, Germany, and most notably being present on the battlefield in Ukraine. And Ukraine has one problem, 600 different drones manufacturers, models, it's crazy. They all speak different languages. It's Babylonian, and they can't bring it together within one country. And now we have NATO. So communication and interoperability is really important. Strengthening the transatlantic alliance with that as well. But that is like right in front of us. And arguably, we should be concerned about that also with respect to Taiwan on a 2-year horizon. We've got to get ready. If we're talking not about what is required to be competitive for the near-peer adversaries on a 2 to 5 year horizon, but we go on a wider horizon, of course we should be worried about quantum computing. We should be worried about keeping the AI edge that we currently have. But I like to usually stick to where the tech area I'm a true expert in, and that's certainly around autonomy, drones, interoperability, and defense. And so I don't want to speculate what's all there, but what I do see, the sense of urgency of investing into technology and supporting the shift from manned to unmanned when it comes to defense, there is not enough urgency there.
And can I add on top of that?
Please.
Look, how are we ensuring you can do more, right? Like European-born, American-based, right, company that should be a model when you have the Chinese that have the edge on the actual making of the drones. And are we going to give them the same competitive advantage they now have in TCOM because we didn't help Ericsson and Samsung, right? It's like, why didn't 10 years ago did we not create tax policy in Europe and the United States to ensure that countries that were our allies and our friends were able to build a technological infrastructure with hardware that is based in an allied nation, right? Let's not make that same mistake now when it comes to the latest kinds of tech. And the battlefield now is swarms, it's drones, it's how we can defend against it. And it's not just about the Chinese using it. It's about the next terrorist who has 100K and can use a swarm to attack something in New York or Washington, D.C., right? And so we're not prepared for those kinds of threats.
Yep, and I want to get into that a little bit more, but first, Andrea, I want to bring you in here. And you obviously, we were talking about your unique experience, industry, State Department, and in the battlefield. So obviously we've seen the war in Ukraine change a lot of the way we do military operations. So tell me, what do you think it has been the biggest impact on the battlefield from what you've been seeing?
Well, so biggest is hard, right? Is because that will change as the battlefield changes. Again, I find that, and it sounds simple, but conflict forces innovation. Conflict on the battlefield, conflict in business, right? It forces you to make change quickly, adapt, and maybe force you to do things that you wouldn't have normally done. Mm-hmm. From the Army, we saw that, again, when you saw Y2K, I'm like, you're talking my, live that. So I've evolved from, I think about that, I was commissioned in 1988. My first assignment was in Germany when the wall was still up. Fast forward a few years later, was deployed in support of Iraqi freedom. Fast forward again. And so you look at that evolution, and I tell folks, as a lieutenant, I was training on Soviet order of battle, like doctrine. We're talking about, T-72s, like memorizing doctrine, memorizing what aircraft and tanks and capabilities. Irrelevant years later, right? Irrelevant. So when we talk about, what is that biggest change, it's how quickly can we adapt? And are there commanders and business leaders and government leaders that are willing to take that risk? I went from government, right, risk averse, to a prime, defense prime, very innovative, to now a small startup. And I'm finding that speed of innovation, it's going to come from industry, right? It's military is helpful, government helpful, but the speed of innovation and the adaptability on the battlefield is going to come from industry. And I hope we talk about it some more on those public-private partnerships, the importance of that. How do we get research from academia into the industrial base? How do we get it from small businesses? We're going to win through our small businesses. How do we fleet those up? So it's really that speed and that evolution of conflict that will define us.
I got it. And Congressman, obviously, everyone here should know we're about a couple weeks away from an election.
Is that still on? Is that?
Pretty sure, if my memory serves me correctly. Obviously, the results will mean that a new administration is coming in. You touched on this a little bit, but tell me, what are you hoping for either administration to focus on or prioritize? Obviously, you're a big AI, cyber, NatSec guy, so what are you thinking?
Here's what I'll say, regardless of who wins in November, directionally, preparing for wars of the future, preparing for great power competition is going to continue. Making sure we're focused on technologies. You know, I can speak from when I came into office in 2015, President Obama was focused on this, and then President Trump continued the work of President Obama, and then President Biden continued the work of Donald Trump. And so whoever wins, whatever new administration, you're going to see that. And I would say Congress recognizes a threat of China. What we do about it, there's still some question. And they recognize that technology is the future. Where we go, how we do that, we don't know. But I would like the next administration to be focusing on using the stuff, okay? Like, everyone wants to talk about generative AI, right? And be like, oh my God, it's an existential threat. It hallucinates. Well, y'all were hallucinating before AI was, right? It's like, how many people have passed on a rumor at breakfast this morning, right? Or use some stat to win, misuse a stat to win an argument with your spouse, right? Okay, like that's hallucinating as well. So I think part of it is use it. And an example I use, Tony Scott was was he the first? I think he was the first chief information officer for the government under President Obama. And he came from VMware, and he was like, we're not using like two-factor authentication in government systems? Like what? And he did a 90-day push, and like all the agencies were forced to do that. Like, I want to see something like that, especially when it comes around AI, using the stuff, because if you want to regulate it, you got to understand it intimately. If you want to limit the harms, you got to understand its potential. And so I hope the next administration is focused on using that, and we can take that to the DoD space as well too, making sure that we're moving these new technologies that we're seeing the Ukrainians adapting on the battlefield, that we're going to have to make sure Taiwan is using to make sure that's being integrated all the way down the stack.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dr. Meyer, I want to bring the question over to you now. Obviously, Chinese-made drones dominate the market. Is that something you're hoping the next administration tackles? Obviously, drones have become a game changer in Ukraine, especially, right?
So Chinese drones are actually the first category where China won, I would say, on merit, the race to consumer products, which, along with 5G, should really serve as a wake-up call. And I'm not clear if we've really fully processed what that means and what that could mean for other technology fields. Now, with the military usage, Ukraine is using this year somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million drones. That's actually a number that rivals consumer volume easily, and is a factor 1,000 or more larger than what NATO is acquiring in the same period. And that's, of course, a game changer, because industry works based on sales and volume, and that's driving it. At the same time, these drones are so inexpensive, they're $1,000 or less. In terms of DoD or MOD budgets, it's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. But we're not seeing right now the government really spending money on it, which is concerning, because it basically means that Russia and China in the defense space start to pull away because the shift to unmanned is not really embraced yet. We see a lot of press and we talk about it, but in terms of budget allocation, it's not really happening at scale. And we're talking about each nation buying one fighter jet less to unlock the budget required. We're not talking about massive shifts. I think that's one thing. The other thing that I'm seeing, because I spend a lot of time in Kiev, I'm there every month or every other month, and then I'm spending time here, I'm spending time with Bundeswehr, with the Dutch forces, and so there are different, I would say, intensities and velocities. It's definitely a joy to work with the forces in Ukraine, with the Unmanned Systems Directorate of the General Staff. The urgency is there. We call this the speed of relevance for the conflict that they operate on, that we operate on. That needs to sink in, because we're after World War II and after the height of the Cold War. World War II gave us airplanes. The height of the Cold War gave us GPS, internet, microchips, a whole number of innovations we don't embrace. We're now in a third cycle with the war in Ukraine, and it's powering the shift from manned to unmanned. And a reasonable response would be to see 10, 20, 30% of NATO budgets moving to unmanned, but that would mean that there should be flowing billions of dollars into that field, which they're not. And so switching to this sort of wartime mindset, to that urgency, I think is absolutely essential, because if we don't, then we will lose Taiwan.
And if you're not buying them, you're not using them, you're not developing tactics, techniques, and procedures and how to use it against your adversaries. And the Russians go back to Syria in the use of autonomous vehicles and electronic warfare. So they are years ahead in the application of these tools into the battlefield. Now, they're not doing they're not being the greatest at that application, but they have that experience. And so if we don't have that, and it goes back to another issue you asked on the question to me was, what can this place do? Pass a freaking budget. Right? Now, I'm of the opinion, and this is coming from a former appropriator. All my appropriator friends are going to get upset with me. We should have we should pass appropriations for 4 years, right? And let an administration that still has a role for the appropriations committee. Let an administration have the ability to think through for at least 4 years. It takes there is zero motivation to innovate, to save, to build for the future. And you got to give them that tool. So 4 years is never going to happen. I could probably accept 2 for one new Congress, but that is such an important piece. Now, does Europe have these same problems? I don't understand. My friends at CEPA can explain that to me. But that is something that is ultimately getting in the way, because you do not have the life cycle to give innovative technology companies the ability to grow and to scale at the speed in order for you to do this. And then when something negative happens, that's when we're going to try to rush, and you don't have the entrepreneurs there to be able to build these things.
And if I can just build on that,
Please.
second and third order effect, if you're a big prime, you can probably muscle through a tough year. If you're a 100-person company or a 200-person company or an innovative 500-person company, it may end you, because it has that trickle-down effect. So because the large prime doesn't want to accept that risk because they're uncertain of the budget, so they may not partner with a new company. So you stifle, it dies. There's so many innovative technologies with leaders and these ideas that don't survive to year 2 or year 3, because starting out, you are dependent on a medium-sized company or large. So it is hard. I would tell you that as a CEO of the new startup, I started November 1st. Coming up on the 1-year mark soon, and there's just not been that predictability. So we have engagements with these companies that go, oh my gosh, you can help me with my cybersecurity shortfalls and my talent pipeline and my XYZ challenge, but we're kind of in a wait and see mode. So I would say that second, third order effect, as a US, maybe big companies can weather that storm, it will kill small, medium companies.
Mm-hmm. Talking about cybersecurity, obviously, this war in Ukraine kicked off with a massive cyber attack, right? And here in the US, we have a massive shortfall in cyber talent, right? Well, maybe not in talent, but in positions being hired. I believe it's about 500,000 right now. Obviously, Andrea, we were just hearing from you. You're in South Dakota now. Is Washington doing enough to foster talent from outside of those big hubs in Silicon Valley, Washington, other places?
So we have how much time?
Take all the time.
I yield the balance of my time.
You do my colleague from Texas. So we talk a lot. We're in the former government, like a lot of talk about it, right? Everybody's in, everybody wants to move, everybody recognizes it. I think the number's close, again, fuzzy math, 700,000, I've heard 750,000. Just here in the US alone, I think it's 3.5 globally. So this is not a US only problem on our workforce development. So they talk about geographic diversity. Again, not to make this personal, lived in DC the last 17 years through my military time, industry time, government time, just moved back to my home state of South Dakota. Come visit, call me, I'll show you the state. Moved back to there in April of this year. You want a geographic diversity. We have almost 100% placement from Dakota State University in our cyber program. It's a national center of excellence for NSA. It's a national center of excellence for DHS. It's been a computer and cyber science program for 40 years. It now has AI programs. We're just starting with quantum. And how hard is it for the Applied Research Corporation for that university to get a contract? It is excruciatingly painful. And we run into this cycle going, wait, you have a cyber shortfall. I have 200 graduates, scaling to 400 graduates in the cybersecurity realm alone, and we can't contract? There is a systemic flaw when that is occurring. So again, we talk about geographic diversity. When you talk to companies about maybe move out of the NCR or Austin or Palo Alto and come to South Dakota or anywhere in the Midwest and start up, they become risk averse. There are those bold companies that have done it and go, oh wait, my employees can afford housing, great strong public schools, I can bike and walk to work most of the year. No state income tax. And again, they're all cleared. My entire team has clearances because it's good quality young people. I've now maybe jinxed it, but but good quality young people. So all I'm saying is they talk about geographic diversity. They talk about the talent shortfall, but we still are a risk-averse government. We still are a risk-averse big businesses. So there's much work to do here. But again, it goes back to people. It goes back to the talent.
Congressman, please, I want to, just thinking about that. Obviously, we've been hearing a lot about Volt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon recently, I think Salt Typhoon, too many typhoons.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm wondering with this, workforce shortfall that we're having right now, I wonder if you could give us a little threat assessment of what you're seeing out of this and, what that might bode for, our European colleagues here too.
Sure. It's only gonna get worse, by the way, right? You're increasing the surface area of attack. So increased interconnectivity, good. Right, love that. But that means there's more things you can hit. You also have a standardization of some of the guts of the internet and computer systems, right? And then you have entities like your energy and water moving to broader software that hackers know how to get into. So the surface area of attack is only going to increase, right? How do you and can NSA is designed to help the .mil and the intelligence community, DHS and CISA, which by the way, I was proud to be one of the folks that helped create CISA with Mike McCall. This was Mike McCall's baby, my friend from Texas. And I think CISA has done a really great job of providing a service to the rest of the .gov space. How do you address these things? Cyber National Guard. If you're a kid and you want to get a cybersecurity degree and go work in the government, Uncle Sam's going to give you some scholarships, right? And then you're going to come in and work for at least 5 years or twice the amount of years of scholarship money that you get. And then after that period of service is over and you go work for a great company, that company is going to loan you back for X number of years. Look, there are things that can be done in a finite period of time, that if you have people that have an understanding of the organization and experience, but introduce those people. Now, I tried to do this and pass this legislation when I was in Congress. One of the problems we ran into is background checks. Like, why does it still take 9 months to do a background
backlog,
check? Right?
Yeah.
Do you really think the dudes I lived next to 10 years ago is going to have any unique insights onto whether or not I'm a risk to working in the federal government? No, right? But all the crap I do digitally, like that we have access to now, we should be able to do this in a day, right? In order to facilitate that movement. So that's how we increase the intellectual flow between the public and the private sector. You have great young people come into the value of learning your career in cybersecurity in the federal government. It's a scale that you don't see anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And that's valuable whatever company you go to. And then those companies that they're now working for, when they see, oh, this is what's really happening, we can provide better services into the government. That's the model we need to get to. But it's so hard for people to think, who holds the clearances, right? Like, how do you do this long term, right? Like, can you do something only in 15 days, right? Like, we got to get beyond that because the threat is ultimately too significant.
Of course. And you want to go ahead, Andrew?
Oh no, I got an amen, got a hand in the air on that one.
Yeah.
Dr. Meyer, obviously, when we think about these security concerns coming from China, obviously we have to think about security concerns with drones. China investing heavily in autonomous weaponry. What's your take on security fears coming out of Washington?
When you say security fears, you mean in defense? Or
I mean in cybersecurity concerns with drones.
Cyber with drones. Okay, so I think let me sidestep the question a little bit. When you talk about not cyber but China as a threat overall, there is definitely a supply chain threat, and I think the events in Lebanon have taught us a lesson about supply chain, and we have that supply chain in commercial drones here. We don't have necessarily alternatives that are domestic. That is a part of the industrial base that needs to be built. And I believe 5G is another great example where we were way behind the curve, corrected late, way behind the curve. So I think looking at technology supply chains geostrategically needs to happen much, much harder. And what I find so interesting is that we are admiring the problem, including in events like this. And there are problems that are expensive, like chips, the CHIPS Act. Takes a lot of money. There are problems that are cheap. The drone supply chain is nothing. Dozens of millions already move the needle. Hundreds of millions completely change a game. Those are not big amounts on a geostrategic scale. So I think being a lot more pragmatic, and what I actually love about the approach of the government here is they start to adopt supporting industry, the supply chain, the American supply chain, and using the support of Ukraine as a means to basically say, like, okay, we can actually solve two problems here. Number one, we can build a domestic base. And number two, we can support Ukraine by supplying not just drones, but also American components for drones, critical components like AI targeting computers and other things to our Ukrainian partners. And that increases domestic capability with a flexible funding mechanism that is way more lenient than the regular acquisition process. I think that can be actually an example for all of NATO, where all of the NATO partners could basically say, like, what do we have in terms of our capabilities that we can contribute, and how can we provide those to Ukraine and at the same time bring up our base. So I think that's a wartime thinking that needs to set in a lot more, because there are all these budget mechanisms now that actually allow you to move quickly that could be used where it's not just drone parts, it's also cyber capabilities where we could defend or I would rather say establish deterrence and at the same time bring up domestic capabilities.
Andrea, I want to pull you in here. How realistic is it to be more domestically focused on, building our base, or NATO focused? And also, I want to obviously hear your opinion on Volt and Flex Typhoon. If you could throw that in somewhere.
I'd like to talk about the part about interoperability and working together. And what I've learned, again, using those chapters of my life, with my time in the military, whether it was deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan, whether it was my time in government, at the State Department, trying to move policy, or now working with partners, is we are stronger as an alliance. You cannot go it alone. But like I said, we've seen it. So when people talk about, the U.S. doing this and others doing it, our competitive edge is because of our alliance. When we talk about China, when we talk about Russia, when we talk about North Korea or Iran, what sets us apart is we don't go it alone. And so I find that in areas, so what can we do to expand interoperability? So it's not only our NATO partners or others in the Indo-Pacific, right, broader. And I think that's an area for the next administration to build upon the work that's been done. There's been some, we talked about norms of responsible behavior. Talk a little bit about, at the rate of business or the pace of business versus the pace of government. I raised in this early summer of 2018 to Secretary Pompeo that we should have a cyber bureau in the State Department. I said, we have pockets all across the State Department, but what if we consolidated that and moved forward for those technology policy ideas with our partners? It was going to be called the Cybersecurity and Emerging Technologies Bureau. He said, great idea, Andrea, run with that. So we formed, what would that bureau look like? And how much would it cost? And what's the right skill set? We took it to Congress, where it got bogged down for, I stopped counting, months, years on.
Sorry about that.
Well, you trust me, Will Hurd was not part of the problem on where it got placed, where within the State Department. So again, silver lining, it was 2022, right? The Biden administration that said we're going to have a cyber and digital policy bureau. Ambassador Nate Fick, if you don't know him, meet him. Amazing leader. Again, his experiences, right person for the right job. But think about that, from ideation in 2018 to execution in 2022 for something as important as cyber policy and now AI policy, right? We're tracking it up at UNGA this week. Discussions being made. So we've got to get better with the rate of that coordination, or we will always be behind. Mm-hmm. Always be behind.
Congressman, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, look, so you need to have the people that need to use these tools being the ones responsible for purchasing these tools, right? And I love always being back in DC because every conversation turns into IT procurement, which, I was the IT procurement guy, right? And so like we try to empower CIOs within agencies to get the digital tools they need. But when it comes to a warfighter, that general should be the one that makes that decision, the branch chief within the CIA who has unique challenges and a unique tool that can fix it. We need to give that authority to the person that's using it rather than bifurcating it. Only in government do you have that. And in a time when we can have transparency in purchasing, you don't need to have some of these archaic steps that were put in place to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. And so these are some of the tools to make sure the government is being efficient, right? And I would say at a time when trust in our institutions is eroding, right? All of our institutions, government at the federal, state, local level, the medical community, science, business. The reason there's erosion of trust is because they're not providing what they're supposed to. And so if we get the government to start being a little bit faster on these things, it's going to solve a whole lot of problems and make sure that we can prevent threats and also ensure that this experiment we call America continues to exist. Oh, and by the way, help our allies as well.
Do you think this the pager explosions in Lebanon maybe kickstarted any of this conversation in NATO countries or over here too?
Look, I think it makes it real, right? Like it makes it real for people. So if you go back to West Texas and be like, we need to fix a supply chain of software, people are like, what the hell does that mean? Pardon my language. And so that was something, that's a real idea, that's a real thing that actually happened, that people are like, oh, I can see the problem in this, right? Now, the one word that we should all be thinking about is out innovating, right? Like, the only way we're gonna win this is out innovate, right? If you say, okay, you're not gonna be able to use our tools, guess what? Things are moving too fast, they're gonna develop their own tools, right? Huawei is the largest telecom provider in the world, right? They're the second largest provider of smartphones. They have their own operating systems. The Chinese are gonna figure out how to get generative AI working and be competitive with us, right? So how are we making sure that we're providing something that is better, cheap, less expensive, that people want to ultimately use, right? And more people would rather buy from us in Europe than they would from the Chinese. And so how are we ensuring our policies, our tax policy specifically, is conducive to that? How are we using the purchasing power of all of our governments to provide a market signal to companies and businesses to say, hey, this is where you should grow? How are we also using that purchasing to provide some stability for cash flow for some of these companies to develop this stuff, right? Like, these are things that a government should be able to do. And then how are we ensure we're educating our policymakers so that the policies and the regulation of all this stuff should work? Look, I'm not one of these that's saying, oh, no regulation. No, someone needs to come in and say, don't do this, right? Because it's bad for the population. So those are some of the steps I think next whoever comes in November should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
I forget what the original question was. So.
You nailed
passionate.
it.
We're passionate, right?
So, Andrea, you and Dr. Meyer obviously are in the tech industry bubble, right? I just want to know how you think U.S. tech can help NATO countries in a more meaningful way. Obviously, we have here in the U.S. A big-time collaboration effort between the government and the private sector, way more than it used to be, just like in the last 10 years, right? So tell me a little bit more.
From the tech sector or from just writ large U.S. to our allies?
Whichever one's easier.
Well, I think they're both hard. So examples, again, when my State Department hat, I was Undersecretary, I was T, Arms Control and International Security, so export controls. Foreign military sales, direct commercial sales was under my purview. That stymied initiative. It stymied initiative. Again, a system that was put in place, right? You want oversight, you want to make sure the end user is using that equipment for what they purchased it for. But so many layers added to it throughout the years, it became insurmountable for key partners and allies to use our equipment or get our equipment. We have seen some movement on that. I use AUKUS as an example. Again, not the end all be all, but AUKUS Pillar 2 and announcements work between the UK and Australia on reforming ours and at nations at home. It was where in other nation states as well on export control reform. That is just one part of the process, but at least opens up that possibility. When we talk about setting up companies in Ukraine, when we talk about setting up companies, and goes both ways, right? What our partners and allies are here that say, why I want to open my company in the US, bring my equipment to the US. That is, the layers of bureaucracy are so deep, it really does back to the initiative. I don't have a legal team of 10 export control subject matter experts, right? I don't have the depth of policy, and not many do. And so you just kind of go, well, it looks like it's going to be US only because that's what we can do. So there again, back to continuing to push on this reform so we can get the best and brightest of the US to partners and allies and vice versa. And I won't bring up immigration, but right, we're not going to solve this talent shortfall organically.
Dr. Meyer, correct me if I'm wrong, your drone software is in an open source nature, am I right?
So I built the world's largest open source developer base. The company's product, it sits on top. because we're building targeting systems in Ukraine. We're not open sourcing targeting systems. That would be not a great idea. But what I can say, and that's by the way true for computing overall, because all of cloud computing is built around open source software, there is a ton of technology that is the fundamental base and that's shared. And by the way, there are export control exemptions for open source software in pretty much every jurisdiction. That solves also a lot of problems. But what we do is proprietary. I think the way we can operate as a software company, export controls are less of an issue. Of course, we have to comply with them. But we found a way to be compliant with German, US needs very efficiently.
Okay, everyone, we're getting ready to open the floor to questions. But while you start percolating some thoughts on what you want to ask everyone, I just want to ask one more question to Congressman Hurd. Obviously, you were on the OpenAI board. At some point, we're seeing a lot of turnover there now. Tell me, how do you square that role with calls that some in Washington want to regulate AI companies more?
Well, I've always been clear that there should be some focus and regulation of AI. I always let people know I was on the board of OpenAI before the coup. Okay. And look, and it starts with something very simple. AI should follow the law, right? Why do we have $1 trillion cybersecurity industry, or multiple $1 trillion cybersecurity industry? Because in the 70s, we carved out software from product liability loss, right? Why do we have social media that's causing crazy harms to teenage kids, increasing self-harm? Because we carved social media out of the laws that protects, CNN and Washington Post and everybody else has to follow. So let's not do that with AI. Follow law. It's illegal to not give somebody a loan because of their color of their skin, right? So if that banker is using a tool the right way, or they're not using a tool the right way and they're using some AI tool and they deny that person, it's that banker's fault. But if that banker uses a tool the right way and the AI system discriminates against that person, it's the developers of that AI's problem, right? It's going to make you have to ensure that your stuff works a little bit better than in another scenario, but we should start with that. And really powerful AI. Europeans have made a decision what they think really powerful AI is. I think it's 10 to the 29th flops. Something that was trained on 10 to the 29th flops. What does that mean? That means the amount of calculation the computer did in order to get to that thing was of a certain size. Roughly, it's something that would have required about 200,000 megawatts of power. If you're two gals in a garage, you're not building an AI system with 200,000 megawatts of power. It's not going to impact you. But if you're powerful AI, you should have to go through some kind of entity that opens the hood, looks under, and says, "Hey, okay, you're following some of the best practices on how to on what we know to ensure this is not going to harm people." Right? NIST is capable of doing that. Pump them a little bit more money, get them a few more people in order to do that. You do those things, right? And start using it more. So I was the gold standard of constituent relations when I was in Congress, because my response time to a constituent that reached out to me was 7 days. I think 7 days is pretty crummy, right? Like y'all will get pissed if if you texted one of your friends and it took them 7 days to respond to you, right? But that's like the gold standard. We should be able to do that in a day. AI can help you with that. Why are we not using more of that in order to communicate with our constituents, right? And so again, use it, right? Really powerful stuff. Be like, hey, let's double check your work, right? And make sure it follows the law.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the crowd? I see someone in the back. Okay.
Right here, this guy right here. Yeah.
Yep.
Hello.
Hey.
Mrs. Thompson, you used to be...
Sorry, before you start, can you introduce
Sorry.
yourself? Yeah.
My name is Liam. I'm a student at George Washington University. I also run an AI safety group on campus. So I'm so happy to be here and thank all of you for all the work you're doing. Mrs. Thompson, I want to address this that you used to be Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. So I want to know your thoughts on the prospects for AI arms control with China around lethal autonomous weapon systems in particular, and also frontier models in general. Do you think that cooperation with China is realistic, or do you think there's just not enough mutual trust for that to be possible?
Oh, great question, Liam, and we're hiring. So no, brilliant question. I will do my best to give you some insight. Again, having been across the table from the Chinese and the Russians as we try to negotiate or renegotiate arms control treaties, my sense is, again, more power to Bonnie Jenkins, Undersecretary Jenkins, and others that are doing God's work, that I think those days are behind us. But the responsible use, and back to Will's comments on norms of responsible behavior, I think we can get to yes there. And we socialize those discussions. Again, I'm no longer in government. I'm quite positive that they're continuing to have those types of discussions. But I think we should all agree that there are norms of responsible behavior. And that is, I've said it again and again to my Chinese and Russian counterparts. Your behavior is not, you wouldn't do that to a colleague, a peer, a family member. That is not responsible behavior, what you are doing. And that was we had talked in the initial, it was cybersecurity. So back to UNGA, back to the UN, we did work there as well, bilaterally, and then through the alliances and others to have that discussion. So do I think there should be an arms control treaty for AI? I do not. One, it'll become irrelevant. We'll get bogged down in discussions that I feel like by the time the government gets to a place, the technology will have evolved 5 different times. So again, back to that pace of bureaucracy. But we have to have those discussions and those with our partners and allies so they're hearing it from all sides on norms of responsible behavior. So we don't stifle initiative, right? We don't stifle the innovation for our partners, but we have that red line going. It was like, no, we don't do that. And there should be repercussions and there should be consequences for that type of action.
Can I add 30 seconds?
Absolutely.
Yeah, please.
Whoops, absolutely.
So the Chinese have to be willing to have some kind of conversations, right? The problem is they're not. And so should we have more track 2 conversations on this? Absolutely. I don't think there's any track 2 where former Chinese government officials are talking with former US officials, where before they have conversations, they're talking to their people to be like, give me a left and a right. None of that is happening. So I don't think that we could get there. However, when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was literally negotiated at the height of the Cold War, where it was the most bellicose rhetoric that had ever happened between the United States and Russia. And I bet you at that time, I haven't seen the archives to figure this out. People are probably like, no way, right? Y'all gonna do that. But the United States and Russia was able to negotiate that thing. What's in it is the hard thing because this is moving so fast, but those kind of conversations should happen. The problem is not the US and Europe trying. The problem is that the interlocutor on the other side has not shown a willingness and a seriousness in pursuing those kinds of conversations.
Okay, we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. We have one person over here.
Musa Hakim Jr. with Lazy Moose Co. Working blockchain. I'm gonna ask earlier if we sell guarding tools and like that. So sorry if the name's confusing. So blockchain is an emerging technology, right? Some people will say it's old technology, depending on who you talk to. When we look at these technologies that come and evolve, and like you mentioned, the next 50 years will be 2,000 years worth of innovation. How do we, from a private standpoint, work with the government to remove some of these bureaucratic roadblocks that have been around for thousands of years? Like, how do we, is it possible to use the technology to societally move forward so we don't run into so many roadblocks that stop people who want to just put their head down and get it done?
Anybody want me to take that one?
I think it's
Look, so you allude to something that's going to ultimately impact us in this new Cold War that we're having with the Chinese government, and that is a future inability of the United States to use economic sanctions as a tool against our. That's the go-to that us and Europe want to use. And if you have the Chinese government, the Russians, the Iranians, and a lot of other folks going to an international system that moves moves renminbi faster than we do, that's going to take away our tools. So blockchain has an important role in that. That's super complicated. Here's what I have found, and what I can say about my colleagues and former colleagues. They want to understand the current trends that's going on. They just need people that have the ability to educate them, right? And so who is that champion that you can work with to say, this is why this matters, puts it within a context, and then give them an ability to go back to their home district, talk about, this is why it's important, this is what I'm doing about this. And so that's how we, as folks that are outside of government, can be influencing it to make sure they're talking about the right things. Don't give a 22-page term paper, right? Give a half a page that has 3 bullet points, right? You know, and pictures nice, right? I'd even take graphs over pictures. But that's how. So there's a willingness, right? And you got to engage with people and give them some context. Don't make them figure out why it's important. You got to explain to them, this is why this is important, and here's some ideas you can do about it. And it's not admiring the problem that we were talking about and saying, hey, here's one thing that you can go do. That's how, and people are going to always be receptive of that if you explain it to them, and they can go back home to explain it.
We have one question back there. Anyone else? Okay.
Hi, I'm Philip Shishkin. I'm a former reporter with the Wall Street Journal, now just a consultant. I have a question for Lawrence. There was a report on Reuters news agency, I think yesterday, saying that Russia has established a covert program in China to manufacture at scale, I think it was a Garpia G3 long-range attack drone. Had a lot of specificity in that story. So assuming that this is true, I'm wondering, what do you think the implications would be for the unmanned battle space in Ukraine? Thank you.
So thank you for the question. I personally believe that we should look at Russia, China, and Iran as an integrated technology ecosystem and supply chain. It's one. It's not 3 countries, it's one. And they've integrated at a pace that NATO has not achieved, even though there is an alliance. And you should absolutely, everybody should absolutely expect for China to support not just the Russian supply chain right now, but also to learn every single lesson out of Ukraine at a pace that thankfully we and a few other companies are learning too and are bringing back to domestic capability. The systems we're currently using in Ukraine are suitable in nature also for the third island chain in the Pacific. But they're doing that too. And so to me, that sounds totally credible. And even if the report is, that will happen, if it doesn't already happen, we should expect Chinese technology to be available at scale. And the concern we should not just have is hey, we need new technology. The concern we should have is our troops in the Indo-Pacific will face autonomous Chinese weapon systems, certainly in 2 years. And so the question is not anymore, how can we deter China with our own autonomous systems? It's more how do we keep our sailors alive against that new threat?
Thank you. Time for one more, but we have to keep it short.
Thanks. Alina Polyakova. I'm President and CEO of CEPA. I just wanted to bring back the conversation a little bit to Ukraine that you just answered the question, Lawrence. Because in the past, we've talked a lot about on this panel and elsewhere about the speed of adaptation and how we're not really set up, not just as the US government, but also our defense industrial base is not really set up for speed in a lot of different ways. And I think, a lot of the big primes, Andre, that you were mentioning, have learned those lessons the hard way when they were asked to ramp up production. And then it's we were just stuck when there's a land war happening in Europe. And, when you go out to the battlefield in Ukraine, and Lawrence, you spent a lot of time going back and forth in Ukraine, in and out of Ukraine. I was just there a week and a half ago. And one of the things I heard from the Ukrainian government that I was pretty shocked to hear, honestly, is that they anticipate in 2025 of having the ability to produce in their entire defense industrial capacity $30 billion worth of capabilities. Primarily that's in the drone space. But they also said that right now they only have and anticipate having contracts, meaning money, for like 8 billion of that. So there's this over 20 billion gap in what Ukraine is able to produce, and potentially not just supply for themselves, but for maybe even Europe, and be complementary in areas where our primes just don't have the comparative advantage, right? Because you're really
sorry
good
to
at
cut you off. Just cut.
I'll finish.
Yeah.
So, there's this situation in which, we are really good at building these exquisite weapons. There's an opportunity in Ukraine. And I'm just curious, how do we think about in a real way the acceleration of that speed? I don't want to get into ITAR and procurement and all this kind of stuff, but what are some concrete things that we can do? And Lawrence, I'm curious if you heard that number too, on some of your last travels over to Ukraine, and what do you think about that?
A question of
Because
speed.
I was pretty shocked.
A question of speed.
Yeah, question of speed and question of answering speed. Yes, Ukraine has told us consistently over the past year that they only have about 40% of funding compared to their capacity. And I think we in the West, across NATO, are admiring the problem of capacity here, capacity there, and Ukraine has capacity, and we're just not putting the dollars behind it. And it's not big amounts in absolute terms. And that's why I keep running around and telling everybody, buy Ukrainian, because you get better capability, combat proven. There should be more collaboration to bring Ukrainian capability into NATO, the same way as Russian capability is brought into China. And yes, I think it's totally credible. And when we have conversations in Kiev, it's always around budgetary limitations, because there's more technology right now available than is actually funded.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We had a great morning, lots of insight here. Thank you to CEPA for hosting us. Thank you, the Embassy of Sweden. That concludes the 2024 Tech Forum on CEPA. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Joe.